Hello and welcome to Interviewing in a Virtual World. I am Cam. I'm a member of the career education team here within Careers and Experience at Western University. And today we are going to be talking about some interview strategies. Although this is geared towards virtual interviewing, don't worry, all of the strategies, tips, and techniques that we discuss will be applicable to any sort of interview, virtual or not. However, we will go over some virtual specifics and considerations towards the end, but more on that later. Before I get too far into what we're going to talk about today, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Career Education would like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinootan nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with the Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. So, let's talk about what we're going to cover today. We're going to begin talking about preparation strategies, 3 easy steps to help you get started, as well as a few others. We're going to talk about questions and responses. What are the types of questions you will face in interviews? They can be broadly defined, and what you should do to respond. We're going to talk about a few other frequently asked questions, other things that you might need to be prepared for, as well as how to ask questions at the end of your interview. And finally, we will talk a little bit about virtual setup. This is, after all, interviewing in a virtual world. So, we always like to begin this when we're doing this workshop in a live version of true or false, just to ask people what they know about interviews so far. What is the point of interviewing? What are interviewers looking for? So you watching at home, take a second and go through these questions. True or false? What are interviewers looking to do? It is true that interviewers are looking to confirm impressions gathered from application documents. That's your resume, cover letter, transcript, statement of intent, whatever you're interviewing for. Those are essentially what they're looking for. It's okay, we have this impression from you. We want to make sure that it's true. Does the paper translate to the person? It is actually false that it is ensuring the most qualified person gets hired for the job. That is not to say that qualifications are not important. However, it is not always the most qualified person that gets hired. You may have been in a position like that where you feel that you are incredibly qualified for a position, but you were not offered it. You weren't successful in your interview because interviewers are looking for a lot of other things. It's not just about who's the most qualified on paper. They may be looking at some of these other things. Further assess if you have the competencies required to do the job. That is true. They want to see if you are motivated to do the job and do it well. That is true. You might be leaning towards false for question number 5, or option number 5 rather, to find a candidate they would personally like to work with, but that is true. You might think that we're all professionals and we don't want to let personal biases or impressions impact our hiring decisions, but at the end of the day, most jobs, you're going to be spending a lot of time with your coworkers and your supervisors and the folks on the interview hiring panel, so they want to make sure that you'll get along and that they would personally like to work with you. Of course, it's true, they would like to find someone who would make a good addition to the team, and it is false. Option number 7. Yes, they want to find someone who can provide brief interviews to their questions and not take up valuable time to an interview. That is incorrect. That's not to say that you shouldn't be concise in your answers, and that's the bulk of what we're going to talk about when we get to the question response strategies. But there are far more important things to evaluate than how concise is someone. You don't want to ramble, you don't want to take up too much time, but you want to give detailed and concise answers, and we're going to provide some strategies on how to reach that stage. So, Before the interview itself, we aren't going to talk about how to actually answer the questions until we talk about what to do before your interview. There are three main strategies that you can do to prepare for an interview. Number one is probably one of the most important ones and one of the easiest ways to make yourself stand out from other candidates, and that is to research the position or the company thoroughly. Most companies, schools, wherever you're interviewing, they will have a website, and you should scour that for any sort of information you can get. Look at the position itself, look at the organizational structure, look at their social media presence, look at most companies will have an about us, a mission statement, 5-year plan, strategic vision. Look at those things. Look at what the company values. Look at what they want to do. Look at what they want to accomplish, and then connect that to yourself. Maybe you're interviewing at a company and they really value creativity and innovation. You're going to want to make sure that you mention those things in your interview. Maybe you want to research some specifics about the role and say that there are over 1,000 employees at that company, and you can use that information to leverage some of your answers when talking about team dynamics and saying, I know that this is a relatively large company as you have 1,000 employees. Here are some of my ideas to help bolster a sense of community within the organization. Tip number 2 is to review your relevant qualifications. This is, again, and it's sort of, you build off number 1. You've done some research, understanding what the organization values, what the position is looking for. Now you want to think about, okay, what can I offer? When you come to researching the position, you're going to want to look through the job description, right? And it'll say, these are all of the required skills that someone in this job needs. And you want to say, okay, what are the top few ones? How do I demonstrate those? But also, what else do you bring outside of the position or the job description? Think about things that make you unique, things that set you apart, things that you specifically can offer to the organization and bring to the role. The third thing you'll want to do is to generate a bank of personal stories. You are very, very likely to be faced with questions around past experiences, and we're going to talk about those a bit. We like to call them behavioral-based questions, but that's just saying, tell me about a time where you dealt with this. Describe a situation where you had to demonstrate that. And so if you have a bank of stories ahead of time that you know that you can refer back to, it'll be really good if you say, oh, okay, this is a question about teamwork. Here's my go-to story for that. And because you want to be able to talk about your experience, demonstrate that breadth of experience, but also provide examples of the behaviors that you are capable of and the actions that you may take. When it comes to actually generating this bank of personal stories, there are a few different approaches. We have 2 examples that I'm going to walk through, and try to think of them more as starting points, as you don't have to follow them exactly. Maybe you just want to have a running list where you jot everything down in bullet points, but if you really want to help brainstorm and consider what your qualifications are, help brainstorm these personal stories and actually have this bank, we're going to talk about 2 methods of doing so. The first option is to do so with a specific job in mind. So you have a job that you're applying for, you have a copy of the job description in front of you, and you want to generate some stories. Break it down by first saying, okay, what is the research telling me? What are the core functions of this job? What does the company value? Then you'll want to think of what are some qualities or competencies related to that. You know, if the company values innovation, you'll want to think about thinking creatively, adapting, producing. And then you'll want to think of any stories that relate to that thing. So in this example, they produced more efficient ways of approaching work with their business class project by implementing virtual meetings. Maybe a bit of an older example, because virtual meetings may not be considered innovative in this mid-pandemic, post-pandemic world, and virtual interviews, but you get the idea. They're thinking about ways that they can demonstrate the skills that are tied to the company values. You might think of one of the core functions of the job. We can look at self-directed learning. What's a related competency of that? Managing time and meeting goals, right? Self-directing, and then what's a personal experience of that? Completing my honors thesis, which involved a lot of setting timelines, creating goals, etc. An alternate approach to the personal story bank is to just make a general one. Maybe you don't have a specific thing you're interviewing for, or maybe you want to make a bank because you're interviewing for a bunch of different positions and you want to just keep this bank with you wherever you go. And so rather than beginning with the job that you're applying for, you'll just enter all the positions and experiences that you've had in the past. So this one, I was a sales associate. Okay, well, what were some of the activities that you were involved in? Selling clothing, working in the cash register, doing inventory. Okay, well then, how did you do that task? What did you demonstrate? How did you go about it? Well, I attended to clients. I worked well with the other associates. I was efficient and quick when responding to clients. Okay, what were the outcomes? What were the impacts? Was there anything specific that you accomplished that you want to talk about? Any good feedback? Receiving accolades from management, being asked to take on more responsibility, bringing back repeat clients, earning a reputation for good inventory knowledge. And then think about, okay, that's my experience. Those are the things that I did. Those were the outcomes. It's the beginning of a story. And then what skills does that demonstrate? That being a sales associate, I learned about communication, I learned about interpersonal skills, I learned customer service, teamwork, flexibility. And then you keep all this in mind when you get to your interview and you're asked, tell me about a time that you had to demonstrate resourcefulness. You know that that is one of the skills you demonstrated as a sales associate, and then you can work backwards and say, okay, let me relate my experience to demonstrate the competency that is being asked for in the interview. So those are how we generate personal story banks. Before we start talking about actual question response strategies, however, I think it's important to spend a bit of time talking about making a good impression and all of the other little things that go into conducting an interview. So this is roughly how first impressions are formed. You might think it's a little disheartening that what you say only accounts for 7%. But keep in mind, this is a first impression. This isn't the whole interview, but when you first walk in or you first pop up on that Zoom screen, yeah, what you say, it's not nothing, but it's a lot more about how you say things in your body language. Do you look relaxed and confident and friendly? Are you saying things in a relaxed manner, or are you being really nervous or really cold? Before the interview itself, in terms of making an impression, show up on time. If you're the type of person who is perpetually running late, set multiple alarms on your phone, make an extra point of emphasis for it. If it's in person, scout out the location beforehand. You can even do a test run there, or you can consider on Google Maps, where am I going to park? What public transit route am I going to take? If it's over Zoom, test your tech, test the link. Maybe you want to try and make sure that Zoom or Teams or Google Hangouts or whatever the interview is being conducted on, make sure that it does not need to be updated. You're not logging in at 10:55 for an 11 a.m. interview. You also want to make sure that you're greeting people, being friendly. If they're offering any small talk or maybe there's an awkward silence, you can try to break that ice and just, oh, how's your day going? You also might want to consider turning off your phone. I know a lot of folks like to just put their phone on vibrate, but personally, if I feel my phone vibrating or buzzing in my pocket, it will make me lose my train of thought. So I usually just turn my phone off entirely, or at the very least, put on airplane or do not disturb mode just so that the notifications aren't coming through. Friends, families, loved ones, they should know that you're in an interview at this time, so hopefully they won't take it personally, but that's my recommendation there. As for the interview itself, it can be a lot to try and remember as you're focusing on answering the questions themselves, but the main thing is just to be confident, be friendly, and mirror and observe how the interviewees are behaving. If they are acting very relaxed, very casual, they just want to have a conversation, then you don't want to appear too stiff. But if they are appearing as full professionalism, then you don't want to come across as too informal. It's never a bad idea to take pauses while you speak, to be mindful of your pace and speak more slowly. Try not to use too many ums or ahs. If anything, you feel yourself wanting to say just take a break. It's okay to take a pause in the conversation. If anything, it will make you appear introspective and wise, rather than just droning on and filling lots of ums and ahs. You'll probably notice a few times throughout this workshop that I add some ums and ahs, and you'll also probably notice some awkward pauses. Those are the parts where I caught myself about to say. Try to avoid talking over other people. Yes, try to avoid fidgeting. Don't play with your hair. Don't play with your jewelry. Slouching or crossing your arms can send bad impressions. Again, body language. Even if you're saying things that are really, really nice and insightful, if your body language or how you say things is coming across as unfriendly or uncaring, that can really go a long way into contributing towards a bad interview. I know for myself, I was interviewing someone for a position once, and even though the things they were saying were all very good answers, they were completely slouched in their chair. The way that they said things was just with a complete air of just not caring. They seemed bored, like they wanted to just be done with the interview already, and why haven't you offered me the job yet? So they didn't get the position. Even though they answered the questions well, myself and the other interviewees, we all agreed that type of attitude wasn't what we wanted on our team. So it can go a long way. After the interview itself, you've been charming, you've been confident, you've been yourself. Send a thank you note. This is something that often gets missed in interviews, but I think it's a very small gesture that goes a long way and speaks a lot about the character of the person who was just interviewed. Within 24 hours, you can even do it in the same day. If you had an interview in the morning, you want to send it in the afternoon or evening. Assuming your interview was scheduled over email, just send an email in the same thread and say, hey, pass my regards along to, name every person in the interview panel by name. Say, I really enjoyed getting to speak with so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. And you can add in a quick thing about, I enjoyed talking about insert one topic that seems to stand out, and I hope to discuss further how I can contribute to your team. Let me know if there are any questions. Hope to hear from you soon. Another good thing to keep in mind, and this is less about a good impression, but just a good interview tip in general, is to write down the questions that you were asked. A lot of times, you're interviewing somewhere, you're going to be having multiple interviews with similar positions at other companies, and the questions are going to be similar if the positions are similar. So write down what you were asked. It can help you prepare for future interviews, whether you're successful in this job or not. It can still serve you well. And it gives a good opportunity to reflect and say, okay, which questions did I answer well? Which didn't I answer well? Were there any that caught you off guard, that surprised you, that you weren't prepared to answer? Well, guess what? Now you know what to practice before your next interview. Last but not least, stay positive, of course. Now, those are all some generalities about preparing for interviews or things to do when you're in the interview, but we're going to spend the rest of our time, well, not all of it, but the next few minutes at least, talking about some common question types and response strategies. There are 4 main types of questions that you'll see. Obviously, these are broad categories, but generally, questions are going to be one of these 4. They may be traditional, general. This is the biggest category. This is the broadest category, but this is just any sort of open-ended question, a range of topics. We'll get into some examples later. There are behavioral questions, which I mentioned earlier. Those, tell me about a time where you dealt with this. Describe, please give an example, etc. It's essentially just asking for a story. They want to see how have you behaved in the past in situations like this, and would you be able to keep that behavior, keep those skills, keep that knowledge, and translate it to this role? If it's a hypothetical question, these are, what would you do if this happened? You're successful in this job and you have a conflict with a coworker. How would you handle it? And that wants to know how you would react in a real life situation. Lastly, there are technical questions. You see these a lot more often in STEM, and that's asking about specific technologies or skills or softwares that are related to the key functions of the role. Beginning with traditional general questions. These could look like any of these. What interests you in this job? What do you know about our company? Why would you excel? How would a former boss or coworker describe you? See, very open-ended. And the biggest problem, hands down, that interviewers have when it comes to this type of question is just not knowing how much to say. Do I talk too little? Do I talk too much? Do I mention one thing? Do I mention 10 things? If, I ask, what interests me about this job? Do I want to list as many reasons as possible to seem excited, or do I want to just offer one or two so that I don't talk for too long? The answer is that it depends, which may sound disappointing, but the main idea behind this and the main strategy to employ is just organizing your answer. And one of the ways to do that is we call it the list method. Simply put, this is making a list of relevant points and things you would like to say. So maybe you want to come up with like 2 points to mention, maybe you want to come up with 3 or 4. It depends. I usually wouldn't recommend more than that because you have the main point that you want to answer, and then you're going to go into details. So if someone asks me what interests me about this job, I would maybe want to talk about point 1, my personal values and why it attracts me to this industry. Point 2, why this company's values are and how that ties into my own values and why I'm interested. And then point 3, I might talk about something completely personal about my own professional development and where I see myself 5 years from now and how this helps me get there. Those are 3 very quick things. And then I'm going to go into detail on them. And so say, here are my values and where I want to move my career. Here's some detail about that, give specifics. Here's the research I found about your company. Talk about that, give specifics. This way, you can plan out ahead of time in your head after the question is asked. Just, that's a great question. Would you mind if I had time to think about it? Plan out how many points you're going to make, what you're going to say, and then that way, you know that you aren't talking too much because you've limited yourself to just saying 2 to 4 different things, but you're still giving relevant detail because you hit on those important points that you want to elaborate on. Another method, rather than making a list, is to form things as a timeline for a general question. So I really like this approach when it comes to questions like tell me about yourself or a weakness, because you can still, same idea, have those relevant points, go into detail on them, but put it in a way that it's a logical progression, it's a narrative, it's an engaging answer. You're not just rambling while they frantically scribble down notes. You're saying, tell me about yourself. Okay, well, in high school, I was very interested in this field, so I decided to start studying it at university. In the summer of my second year, I was offered a research position within this field, which deepened my knowledge of it further. And in my personal life, I also enjoy working on this field, and so I'm applying to this master's program because it ties together all of those things. That was starting point in high school, introduction to the field. Relevant point number 1 was that research opportunity that got you thinking about graduate school and further education. Relevant point number 2 is talking about your personal life and some of how that relates to what you want to study academically, and then how that relates to the present, the future, why you want to apply to that specific program, what about that school. Obviously, that example was for someone who's interviewing for a graduate or professional school, but you can see how you could do the same thing for a job interview, such as what is a weakness? And we're going to talk a little bit about weakness questions later on, but thinking about here's the starting point, here's my weakness, and then relevant points, you want to talk about what steps you've come to overtake that and what things that you've done recently to help improve that weakness and build upon that and address that gap in your skill set. Moving in a clear narrative of past, present, and then even future. So those are the 2 strategies that we recommend for general questions. Next up, we have behavioral questions. Again, story time. Tell me about a time that you dealt with this. Please provide an example of when you were faced with this. And the structure/strategy for this one is the STARS method. You may see slight variations of this. Some people say STAR with 2 R's, but it's an acronym with the S standing for situation, setting the context for your story. What was going on? Where were you? This is one of the parts that people struggle with the most, is knowing how much context to give. But I always say just try to keep it to what's relevant to your story and then go from there. T is the task. Be explicit in describing what was required of you. What specifically were you asked to do, or what was the situation? What was the challenge that you were being faced with? And then A, action. What did you do? you're going to want specifically to talk about what you did. It can be very tempting if the question is about, tell me about a time you were part of a successful team, to mention all the things, oh, we did this, we did that, we worked well together. But you'll want to mention I. Don't talk about we. You're not interviewing the whole team. You just want to talk about what you did. What role did you take on that team? I went out of my way to organize team meetings. I'm the one who arranged and delegated responsibilities. You're also going to talk about why you made some of the decisions that you did. If it was anything even slightly controversial, talk about your thought process so that interviewers get to see that side of you and know how your mind works and how you would respond if faced with a similar situation in this role that you're being evaluated for. The R in STARS stands for result, and that's where you want to be explicit. Talk about what happened. Can you quantify or qualify the result? Can you give any data? Say we received a mark of 80%, sales were increased by 15%. Maybe you raise a certain amount of money for charity, or maybe just qualitative. I received feedback from my supervisor. I got a good customer referral. I was given an Employee of the Month award. Anything like that. And then S is the summary. Here, I think there are mainly two things that you can talk about, and that is A, did you learn anything? Would you do anything differently? And then B, how is this story relevant? How does it relate to the job that you're currently interviewing for? What skills did you learn that can be applied to the current position? So we're going to go through an example. It is a lot of text on the screen, but bear with me. The question here is, tell me about a project that you planned. How did you ensure it was completed on time and was of high quality? So the answer that this person is going to go with, project management, organization, time management, go to their personal story bank, completing their honors thesis project. So we're going to begin with S. What's the situation? Well, here's all the necessary context. Not too much, not too little. It was the 4th year of my degree, final project that I needed to complete it. I was doing a thesis on evolution and mate selection, which I had no prior experience, which is important to note. It was a flexible completion timeline, little to no direct supervision, and I also had a full academic course load with extracurricular involvements. So you understand how busy the person was, how inexperienced they were, and how little guidance they were given. Already setting the stage for some good interpersonal or intrapersonal skills, rather, about time management organization. T, what was their task? Being explicit, right? You might think that completing an honors thesis is self-explanatory, but here we need to spell it out. What were you asked to do? Well, here are some of the tasks. I had to write a large research report, review the literature, conduct primary research, present results to the scholars in the field, etc. Again, minimal guidance from my supervisor, one of 7 students in the lab, so really emphasizing that it was self-directed. I had to set my own schedule and learn how to write a thesis. Okay, phenomenal. What are some of the actions that you took? I divided the project into smaller sections and identified timelines for completion. I reviewed completed thesis projects from previous years. I scheduled regular meetings with my supervisor. I took initiative to better understand unfamiliar information, stepped outside of my comfort zone, and take the lead on organizing the research component, mentioning a lot of specific steps that they took, specific actions, and it's showing that they're not afraid to, direct their own learning, and they're not afraid to go out of their way to advocate for their needs, right? Talking to their supervisor, asking for frequent feedback and more regular meetings. They went out of their way to consult literature, look at previous projects. Those are all ways that they ensured it was of high quality. What were the results? Well, did they quantify or qualify it? Yes, I completed my thesis prior to my deadline, giving plenty of time for revisions. I was given positive feedback from my supervisor. I was able to present my findings at a poster presentation, and quantifying it, received 88% on the final thesis, one of the highest marks in the class. Summarizing it, what did you learn? I learned how to work efficiently within structured timelines, setting short and long-term goals. I learned an understanding of the importance of taking initiative to fill in gaps in my own knowledge, ensuring the highest quality. Look at that. They also learned the importance of how to ask for help where you need it, how to solicit feedback. If we knew what this person was applying for, they might also want to talk about how those skills would relate to that current position. But this is already a pretty solid answer. They mention all of the things. It's structured well. They're answering the prompt in full while providing enough detail. STARS method, folks. Can't go wrong. You might think that this is a really long answer or that this is too much detail, but not necessarily. It is worth noting that it's about being concise, right? It was long, but it was concise. It was detailed, but it was no extraneous information. It was a lot of necessary setting, a lot of necessary talking about the specific task, talking about the actions. That's good. That's what people want to hear. But then talking about the results and the summary, those are all very, very important aspects that you cannot ignore. As for situational questions, also known as hypothetical questions, we have another fun acronym here, and this is known as the RACED method, R-A-C-E-D. R is to restate the situation or restate the question. It will help you imagine yourself in the situation. It's a good active listening technique to repeat things back, make sure you can clarify if there was anything you missed or misunderstood. Analyzing it, talk about, okay, what is the actual dilemma? What are both sides? A lot of times situational questions will be around some sort of conflict or issue, and so you'll want to show that you have an understanding of every perspective. This is the bulk of your answer, talking about the cause or the outcome. What are some of the possible causes? What's best case scenario versus worst case scenario? Maybe you need to make some assumptions to help fill in your answer. Maybe you'll want to talk about some of the potential outcomes of different decisions that you might make. You'll want to talk about experience if you have any. If you've dealt with something similar in the past, then just talk about that story. Say, yes, I have dealt with a difficult team member in the past, or I have had to give feedback to a supervisor. And lastly, D, decide. Talk about what you would do definitively, talk about why you would do it, and talk about potential ramifications of that action. So, another example here to go through. The prompt this time is that you have a conflict with someone who is senior to you and is not your supervisor. Describe how you would handle it. If this were a real interview, the hypothetical prompt may give a bit more information than this, and you'll see in the answer some assumptions are made to fill in the gaps, and that's okay. Because at the end of the day, the interviewers are evaluating the behaviors, the actions, the thought process, not the situation itself. So you're restating it. I'm working on a project. One of the team members who's senior to me strongly disagrees with a suggestion that I have made, which I believe crucial to the success of our work. So let's analyze it, right? I'm not in a position to make a final decision yet, but I'm part of the team and I'm responsible for successful outcomes. So you're understanding your positionality, and then cause outcome. I mentioned this would be the bulk of it. The best case scenario is that the team member simply misunderstood me. Worst case scenario is that they do fully understand me but still object. Okay, well then, so what are some outcomes? If I push my agenda, I run the risk of disrupting team dynamics, creating sides, or impacting my reputation and working relationship with my supervisor. Plus, I'm not in an authority position on the team, so you have to consider that. But if I retract my suggestion, we might be missing out on a great opportunity. Again, this is something that, this person believes strongly in. So perhaps it's not that they've been misunderstood, it's that they haven't provided enough evidence to support their suggestions, or they haven't solicited appropriate feedback. Maybe they're the ones missing the big picture and need to understand better why their recommendations are not supported. So you can see here they're really going through all the potential causes, all the potential outcomes. I like that it has an air of self-reflection and saying, okay, maybe I was the problem, rather than just assuming in this hypothetical conflict that the other person is completely wrong. So move on to E. Do you have experience? If you do, just use the STARS acronym. And then let's talk about a decision. So this person, we're just going to go through step by step and say, Few actions I would take. First, I would ask for feedback on my recommendations to understand why they weren't supported. If clarity is needed, I would ask to present my recommendations again with more supporting evidence after the meeting over email or at the next meeting. Need some time to prepare myself. After that, if the recommendations still are not supported, I'd go ahead with the group consensus and just continue to work hard to ensure the success of the project. Even though they might feel deflated, knowing that they were, when working in a group setting, it's important to have strong team dynamics and to all be working together towards the same goals. Being flexible and being adaptable are qualities and strengths and values that they have, and so they wouldn't want to jeopardize any future working relationships by creating tension or disrespecting the ideas of others. So this person very clearly advocated for themselves, but they had some moments of self-reflection and said, maybe I would get feedback, maybe I would try to present it again. If that didn't work, I would go ahead anyway, because at the end of the day, the person is their superior and they want to keep those good working relationships. Note that they didn't just roll over because they said the person is senior to me and I want to respect that. They talked about why. They talked about their flexibility and their adaptability. They talked about the importance of team dynamics and how that's something that is important to them. So I think this is a really good example of how to walk through a conflict and how to deal with a hypothetical question. The fourth and final question type are technical questions. And for these, we call them parallel responses because essentially you have two different options. If you are asked a technical question and it's something that you've dealt with in the past, like it's very, very similar to something you've already done, then just use the STARS method and say, I actually have dealt with that, here's what I did. Or if you have no experience with that, treat it like a hypothetical and go through a bit of the RACE model and say, here are the potential impacts, here are some of the causes and outcomes, here are the actions that I would take, and following that same model to make sure that your answer is concise and organized and detailed enough. So those are all of the question response strategies and ways to handle different types of questions. Now I just want to spend a bit of time going over some other FAQ when it comes to interviews. One of the most common questions we get, and I told you we'd come back to this, are weakness questions. Anything like straight up, what's your greatest weakness? What are some aspects of the job that you might find challenging? Where would you need additional support in this role? Tell me about a time you received negative feedback. Tell me about a mistake that you've made in the workplace. Anything like that, where it's asking for a weakness or a mistake. The main thing to keep in mind, and some tips for answering, please do not give one of those answers of I push myself too hard or I care too much, because those answers are inauthentic and transparent. They don't look good. They will not reflect well. No interviewer is going to take that seriously. Instead, you will want to be honest. Pick an actual weakness, an actual flaw, one that's not so small that it's insignificant, but not one that's so big that it would really jeopardize your ability to work in the role. And so then, most important part is to list the steps that you've taken to overcome those weaknesses, or strategies or plans for future improvement. So an example of this, a very quick one, I struggle with my confidence, so I asked my last supervisor for more frequent feedback. Right? That's saying, yeah, struggling with confidence, that's a genuine weakness, that's believable, but people can obviously still do their job if they have that weakness. And then this person is saying, in the past, I've dealt with that by asking for more frequent feedback and just seeking that support. Another example is English isn't my first language, so I make communication errors sometimes. But current strategy, I have a spell check tool installed on my email account, and I plan on taking night school courses. So you can list things that you currently do, things that you've done in the past, things that you plan on doing, but any way of showing that, yes, I have a weakness. Here is what I have done to resolve that. Here's what I plan on doing. I'm showing initiative and I'm showing determination in my own growth and development to overcome this obstacle and to ensure that it won't become an issue moving forward if I were successful in this role. That's how you answer weakness questions. You may be asked questions around the pandemic. You might be asked something along the lines of what have you learned about yourself during the pandemic? You might be asked, more simple yes or no questions. Can you do this while working from home? Are you willing to move to an office? You may get questions about how you've been spending your time during the pandemic, during quarantine when we were all at the stay-at-home orders. Or you might be asked about if you have any questions for them regarding their work from home policies or how their company has handled the pandemic. So no real tips here other than to just look out for these, be prepared, and be honest. I wouldn't recommend lying to a company and saying, oh yeah, I can work from the office when the pandemic is over. And then if that day comes and you lie to them and say, no, actually, I can't relocate, that's not going to be good for anyone. One important thing to note is that there are illegal questions in an interview. Hopefully, you'll never have to encounter these, but I think it's important to be aware and know your rights and know what is and is not allowed. So, keeping in mind, you cannot be expected to answer anything about age, marital status, ethnicity, gender identity, disability, religion, any other sort of personal detail like that. You can, however, be expected to ask something if it is directly relevant to the job. So they can't ask, are you a Canadian citizen? But they could ask, are you legally entitled to work in Canada? Someone could not ask, what is your religion? But they could ask, are you able to work on Sunday mornings? So you can, a few different things if you're asked something like that. You could just straight up refuse to answer, but keeping in mind it's an interview, you may not want to be confrontational or appear combative or stubborn, so you have a few different options. You could consider asking them why they seek that information or if they could rephrase the question. An example is maybe an employer asks, how much do you weigh or how tall are you? And you could respond and say, I'm assuming you're asking me that because one of the job descriptions is to be able to lift boxes weighing up to 40 pounds. If you're wondering, yes, I am capable of performing that. So that way you're not giving away any personal information, but you're still giving them the information that they're seeking. And like I said, hopefully this doesn't happen to you. I haven't had too many instances of students telling me that they were asked an illegal question in their interview, but it's important to know if you feel uncomfortable, if someone asks you something really personal about sexual orientation, for example, I can't imagine why that would be relevant to a job, so you may refuse to answer that one straight up, or just, I'm sorry, why are you asking me that? It's my understanding that it's illegal for interviewers to ask for personal details. Could you maybe rephrase the question in a way that, is a bit more direct to find the information you're looking for? I don't know if I phrased that perfectly, but you get the idea. Another very common thing is, what do I ask at the end of an interview? Right? It's normally the very last thing. Do you have any questions for us? Things that you should not ask are, like I said, I keep coming back to this, but research the company. So you don't want to ask anything that can be Googled or found on a company website. You don't want to ask basic things about the job description or ask how many employees does your company have, because you can probably find that information elsewhere. You don't want to ask questions around pay, benefits, vacation, etc. in the initial interview. Let me be clear that you are more than justified to ask that information, but I believe that those sorts of conversations can be had if and when you are extended an offer and the negotiations can truly begin. I don't see any reason why asking that in your initial interview would be necessary, and it may send the wrong impression. You don't want to ask about clarification on any gossip that you may have heard. You don't want to ask about, how quickly do promotions occur, or other sort of things like that that can come across as self-serving. There are so many better ways to phrase that. Maybe instead of asking how quickly do promotions occur, you can ask, what opportunities for internal development and advancement does this company offer? Still driving at the same thing, but it sounds a lot prettier. Don't ask if your company email will be monitored. Again, think about the impression that sends. But things that you can ask, Thinking about ways that you can demonstrate research or an understanding of the company or the role. Saying, oh, it's my understanding that this role deals with both client interaction, but also some administrative support. What is the rough distribution of those responsibilities in an average week? That way you're showing that, yes, I've researched this and I understand this, but I want some specifics. Maybe you want to ask about something that will allow you to discuss your values. Maybe, social justice and equity work is very important to me. Would I have any opportunity to join some of those projects or advisory groups here? You can ask people what they enjoy about working at a certain company or living in a certain city. I mentioned before specific questions about the day-to-day of the job, or even, what's a typical week look like. Again, not stuff that's found in the original job posting. And you can also ask general questions about future growth or industry trends, the direction of the company, things like that. Last but not least, I said we were going to talk about interviewing in a virtual world, so let's talk about some of those considerations. There are a few things to keep in mind for a virtual interview. One of the first things that you'll want to be cognizant of is your background. You're in a Zoom window, what's behind your head? Typically, we recommend just keeping it simple. Blank wall is good, or you can consider something that says a bit about you. If you like to read, maybe you want to have your bookshelf in the background. I always encourage people to try to avoid virtual backgrounds if at all possible, just because unless you have a professional green screen, and still even then, they can be distracting and choppy and take away from the words that you're actually saying. So minimizing distractions is always the best. That being said, if you have a really messy apartment and there's nothing you can do about it based on the way that your computer is facing, then a virtual background is better than a super cluttered background. But just try to keep in mind that the simpler the better, unless you have something that'll make a statement about you. It's a piece of art or a wall decoration or something along those lines. Consider where the light source is coming from. It's always best if you are facing a window or something so that the light is directly on your face. Try not to have a lamp or a big source of light behind you. That'll wash you out. It'll just look bad on the video. Considering, keeping the camera at eye level. Don't cut off part of your face. You'll want to test your tech ahead of time. I think most folks by this point have a pretty good setup for webcam, microphone, headphones, etc., but it's never a bad thing to test them. I usually encourage doing a test call with your friend or a roommate if you have one. If you don't have any friends, you can still just create a Zoom call, hit record, talk to yourself, end it, even if there's just one person in the call, just to test how your microphone comes across. If you have concerns about your Wi-Fi connection, move close to a router or use a cable. Consider putting in headphones so that you don't get any feedback from the interviewer's voices coming out of your speaker and then being picked up by your microphone. So considering all of those things. And then last but not least, mention this one of the very first slides at the beginning of this workshop, but turning off distractions. And yes, we're talking about phones. Like I said, airplane mode or do not disturb is probably the best, as vibrations can be very, very loud if it's, just sitting on a table or a desk. But also thinking about other distractions. If it's a virtual interview, you'll probably be doing it from home. Do your roommates or does your partner know that you're in an interview at that time? Do you have a plan for keeping pets out of the way so that they don't knock anything over while you're in the middle of your interview? Or maybe you want to have your pet there as a conversation starter or an icebreaker. It's up to you and the type of company you're working for, but as long as it's not going to be an unnecessary distraction that will detract from your interview. One last tip for video interviews: dress for success. I haven't mentioned dress code or attire at all during this workshop, and I think that's pretty intentional, but just keep in mind that even if it is a video interview, you'll probably want to dress up in full dress. Don't wear just a nice shirt and sweatpants underneath, because you'll never know when a webcam falls over, you need to get up to close a window, or you dropped a pen, and then all of a sudden they're interviewing someone who has pajama pants on underneath their dress shirt, and it'll look silly and show a lack of commitment. So Consider that, but also consider like the psychological benefits of feeling in the zone and your body making an association with being fully dressed up, even for a video interview. So that is it for tips on how to have an interview and best practices. If you are looking to practice, take some of the notes and things that you've learned today into consideration. We have mock interviews available for all Western students and alumni within 1 year of convocation. They are 45 to 60 minutes with a career coach such as myself or one of my colleagues. They can be Zoom or in person. This slide actually needs to be updated. We also have peer mock interviews with our career profile advisors. Those are our student volunteers. Those are only 30 minutes. You can have as many of those as you want per semester. A little bit less pressure. Some students find it less intimidating than having one with a career coach. We have an interactive module called Complete Student that goes through a lot of really good information, similar to what I've covered in this workshop, but valuable nonetheless, and a lot easier to go at your own pace because I am aware that I can talk quickly. Last but not least, we have a website called Interview Stream that you can view or practice with rather, and that is simply you and a webcam wherever, whenever, over 1,500 questions. You can have an interview bank of the types of questions you want to answer. Watch yourself in an interview. You won't get any feedback from this option, but maybe you don't need someone else to tell you that you talk quickly or you say a lot or you play with your hair or have any other weird tics. It's always good to practice, and it's always very good to watch yourself and receive that feedback internally. If you'd like any other career support, you found this workshop helpful, hey, glad to hear it. We have lots of other workshops. We offer them every September to April during the school year. We also have a suite of recordings on our website, as you are most likely aware, since you found this one. We have topics on everything from LinkedIn to networking to resumes and cover letters and job searching and designing a meaningful life. We have career appointments, similar to the mock interviews, one-to-one support with any career-related topic. Those are for current Western students and recent alum, career coach such as myself, and we can talk about anything. We also have our Employment Resource Center, the ones who offer the peer mock interviews. They also do personalized feedback on resumes, cover letters, LinkedIn profiles. Just send them an email with your documents. They'll give it back to you with feedback. Pretty handy. As well, on our website, which you can see at the top, career.uwo.ca, we have a lot of online resources, websites, podcasts, tools like Complete Student or Interview Stream, workshop recordings, sample resumes, etc. Thank you very much for attending this workshop. I hope it was helpful. Please reach out to Careers and Experience, the career education team, or Western Student Experience, whose socials are on the screen right now. We are more than happy to support you however you can, and happy interviewing, folks.